Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something really fundamental, something that explains why the real world doesn't always line up perfectly with those neat market diagrams. Think about this for a second. Paper. We all use it. But imagine the factory making that paper releases dioxin, a harmful chemical, into the local environment. People nearby might face health problems. The paper itself might be cheap, but is that the full cost? Who's really paying?
Exactly. It raises a big question.
We've talked a lot on previous deep dives about Adam Smith's invisible hand, right? How people acting in their own self-interest can, maybe surprisingly, lead to the best outcome for society overall. But what happens when that invisible hand doesn't quite reach everyone? What if some costs or even some benefits just get left out of the market price?
They fall outside the transaction.
So our mission today is to unpack exactly that. We're diving deep into Chapter 10 of Mankiy's Principles of Microeconomics. We want to explore why markets sometimes fall short, why they aren't always perfectly efficient, and crucially, what can be done about it.
That's the core of it. This chapter is all about externalities.
Externalities.
These are the uncompensated impacts of one person's actions on someone just standing by, a bystander. And what's really fascinating, I think, is how these seemingly side effects can actually have pretty big consequences for society's total well-being. We'll look at why they cause market inefficiencies and then explore the different ways both government actions and private solutions that society tries to address them. It's about nudging markets to see the bigger picture.
Okay, let's get down to brass tacks then. What exactly is an externality? Lay out the definition for us.
Sure. So an externality exists whenever an activity, could be a production or consumption, impacts the well-being of a third party, a bystander, who neither pays nor receives compensation for that impact. If the impact on the bystander is negative, harmful, we call it a negative externality.
Okay.
If the impact is beneficial, it's a positive externality.
And why does this distinction matter so much for, how markets work?
It matters hugely because when buyers and sellers are making their decisions, they typically only look at their private costs and benefits. If there are these external costs or benefits floating around that they don't consider, well, then the market equilibrium, that point where supply equals demand, it just won't maximize the total benefit to society as a whole.
I see. So the invisible hand kind of misses something.
It does. It fails to account for these side effects leading to inefficient outcomes.
That makes sense. Can you give us some concrete examples, things we might encounter every day that really illustrate these negative and positive externalities?
Absolutely. Let's think about some common ones.
Yeah.
For negative externalities, car exhaust is a big one. When you drive, your car puts out smog. That affects air quality, maybe worsens asthma for people living nearby. You, the driver, don't usually pay directly for that damage.
Right. So we might drive more than is actually ideal for society.
Exactly. Which is why governments step in with things like emission standards or taxes on gasoline. They're trying to make drivers account for that external cost.
Okay. What else?
How about a barking dog? Your neighbor's dog barks all night. It disturbs your sleep. The owner enjoys having the dog, but they don't bear the cost of your lost sleep.
They don't compensate me for being tired the next day.
Right. So they might not take enough steps to keep the dog quiet. That's why towns have noise ordinances, like disturbing the peace laws.
And the paper factory example we started with.
Perfect example. The factory makes paper, sells it, covers its production costs, but the pollution, the dioxin, imposes a health cost on the community that isn't reflected in the price of paper. That's a classic negative externality. The firm, acting in its self-interest, ignores that external pollution cost.
Got it. So those are the negative ones. What about the flip side, the positive externalities?
Good question. They're just as important. Think about restored historic buildings. Someone buys an old, dilapidated building and fixes it up beautifully.
Yeah, that can really improve a whole street.
Exactly. Everyone who walks by gets to enjoy the beauty and the sense of history. That's a positive spillover. But the owner who paid for the restoration, they can't easily charge every passerby for enjoying the view.
So they might not capture the full social benefit of their investment.
Precisely, which could mean fewer buildings get restored than would be ideal for the community. So governments might offer tax breaks for historic preservation or put rules in place to prevent demolition.
Interesting. Another example.
Research into new technologies. This is a huge one. A company spends millions on R&D, maybe develops a groundbreaking new software algorithm or a new material.
Okay.
They benefit, sure, maybe through sales or a patent, but often the knowledge itself spreads. Other companies learn from it, build on it. It advances the whole industry, maybe boosts productivity across the economy.
That's the spillover effect.
That's the technology spillover. It's a positive externality. The original company can't capture all those downstream benefits. So, from society's point of view, firms might underinvest in fundamental research if left purely to the market.
And that's where patents come in.
Exactly. Patent systems try to address this. By giving the inventor exclusive rights for a period, it allows them to capture more of the economic rewards, making the R&D investment more attractive. It helps internalize that positive externality.
It's really fascinating how these, like, hidden costs and benefits are everywhere once you start looking. So, okay, we've established what they are. How do they specifically mess with market efficiency?
Right. To really see this, we need to quickly dip back into what economists call welfare economics. Remember, that's about how the allocation of resources affects overall economic well-being.
Okay, quick recap.
In a simple market, say, for aluminum, without any externalities, the demand curve shows the value buyers place on each unit.
Yeah.
The supply curve shows the private cost to sellers for producing each unit.
Right. Willingness to pay versus cost to produce.
And the market finds an equilibrium quantity where supply meets demand. At that point, the total value to buyers minus the total cost to sellers, what we call total surplus, is maximized. That's the efficient outcome. The invisible hand working perfectly.
Got it. Standard supply and demand efficiency.
Now let's bring in a negative externality. Let's stick with aluminum production, but assume it creates pollution. This pollution harms people downwind. That's the external cost. So the true cost to society of producing aluminum isn't just the factory's private cost, labor, materials, etc. It's the private cost plus the external cost of the pollution damage. We call this the social cost.
Okay, so the social cost is higher than what the producer pays.
Exactly. If you were to draw this, the social cost curve would sit above the regular supply curve, which only reflects private costs. The vertical distance between them represents that external pollution cost per unit.
Right.
Now, think like a benevolent social planner who wants the best outcome for everyone. They'd want to produce aluminum only up to the point where the value to consumers, the demand curve, equals this higher social cost. That gives us the socially optimal quantity. Let's call it Q optimum. But what does the market do on its own? Firms only look at their private costs. So the market equilibrium happens where demand crosses the private cost curve, the supply curve. Let's call this Q market.
And how does Q market compare to Coptimum?
Q market will be larger than Q optimum. The market produces more aluminum than is socially optimal.
Because producers aren't facing the full cost.
Precisely. For all those units between Q optimum and Q market, the value consumers place on them is actually less than the true social cost of producing them, including the pollution. So producing those extra units reduces overall economic well-being. The market fails, it leads to overproduction.
Okay, so the market, left alone, makes too much stuff that causes pollution or other negative side effects. How do we fix that? How do we get producers to sort of recognize that external cost?
Great question. The key concept here is to internalize the externality.
Internalize it.
Yeah, basically change the incentive so that buyers and sellers do take those external effects into account when making their decisions. For a negative externality like pollution, one common government tool is a tax.
A tax on the polluting good.
Exactly. Imagine the government imposes a tax on each ton of aluminum produced and sets that tax exactly equal to the external cost of the pollution.
Okay.
Now, the producer's effective cost includes their private production cost plus the tax. If the tax equals the external cost, their effective cost curve becomes the social cost curve.
Ah, so the tax shifts the supply curve upwards?
Precisely. It shifts it by the amount of the external cost. And where does the new market equilibrium settle? Right at Q optimum, the socially efficient quantity. The tax forces the decision makers to confront the true cost of their actions.
It's making the external cost internal to their decision-making.
You got it. It's a classic case of people respond to incentives.
Okay, that handles negative externalities. What about the positive ones, like education? You said the market produces too little.
Right, the logic is very similar, just flipped. Take education. When you get educated, you benefit privately higher wages, maybe more job satisfaction. That's the private value reflected in the demand curve. But society also benefits, right? More educated people might mean more informed voters, lower crime rates, faster technological progress. These are benefits that spill over to others.
Positive externality.
Exactly. So the social value of education, the private value plus this external benefit, is greater than the private value alone. If we drew it, the social value curve would lie above the regular demand curve.
Okay.
The socially optimal quantity of education would be where this higher social value curve intersects the supply curve, which represents the cost of providing education. Let's call that Q optimum again. But individuals making decisions based only on their private benefits will choose a quantity based on where the private demand curve hits supply. Call that Q market.
And just like before, Q market is going to be different from Q optimum.
Yes, but this time, Q market will be less than Q optimum. The market, left to itself, produces too little education compared to what's socially desirable because individuals don't capture all the societal benefits.
So the market underproduces goods with positive side effects. How do we internalize that externality?
The opposite policy tool, subsidies.
Ah, makes sense. Tax the bad, subsidize the goods.
Pretty much. If the government provides subsidies for education, maybe funding public schools, offering student loans or grants, it effectively lowers the private cost or increases the perceived private benefit for individuals.
Which encourages more people to get educated.
Exactly. It shifts the demand curve or supply curve, depending on how the subsidy is structured, so that the market equilibrium moves closer to, or ideally reaches, the socially optimal quantity, QOP to round.
So just to recap the core idea here, negative externalities mean the market produces too much, and the fix is often a tax. Positive externalities mean the market produces too little, and the fix is often a subsidy.
That's the fundamental logic for government intervention based on externalities. It's all about aligning private incentives with social costs and benefits.
It provides a really clear rationale for a lot of policies we see. And you mentioned technology spillovers earlier as a key positive externality. Can we dive a bit deeper into that?
Sure. A technology spillover is just that positive externality specifically related to research and innovation. One firm's breakthrough often provides a foundation for others. Think about the development of industrial robots.
Okay.
A company designed a better robot arm. That might directly benefit them, but the knowledge gained, maybe new engineering principles, software techniques, contributes to the overall pool of technological knowledge that other firms, maybe even in different industries, can then use.
So society gets a bigger benefit than just the inventing firm.
Right. Now, some argue this justifies industrial policy, government actively subsidizing industries that are thought to generate large spillovers, like robotics or semiconductors.
Does that work?
Well, economists are pretty divided on it. The big challenge is measurement. How do you accurately measure the size of those spillovers? It's really hard.
I can imagine.
And there's always the political risk. Governments might end up subsidizing industries that are politically well-connected rather than those with the truly largest spillovers.
So politics gets in the way of efficient policy.
It can. A less controversial and generally more favored approach to internalizing the technology spillover externality is patent protection.
Which we touched on. How does that work again?
By granting an inventor exclusive rights to use their invention for a set period, a patent allows them to capture a larger share of the economic benefits. They essentially get a temporary monopoly. This increases the private return to R&D, encouraging more innovation in the first place. It makes the private incentive more closely match the social value.
Got it. So patents are another way to internalize a positive externality. Okay, this brings us to the broader question of public policies. When private solutions aren't enough, governments step in. What are the main tools they use?
Broadly speaking, governments use two main types of policies to deal with externalities. First, there are command and control policies. These directly regulate behavior. Second, there are market-based policies. These use incentives to get private decision makers to solve the problem on their own. Economists generally prefer these.
Okay, let's take command and control first. What does that involve?
This is the more traditional form of regulation. It literally means the government commands or controls actions. The most extreme form is just making things illegal, like dumping toxic waste into rivers. You simply cannot do it.
Right, because the harm is so great.
Exactly. But for most pollution, eliminating it entirely isn't feasible or even desirable given the trade-offs. So command and control often involves setting specific limits. The Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, might mandate that factories cannot release more than a certain amount of a particular pollutant.
Or they might require firms to adopt a specific technology.
Yes, they might say, you must install these best available scrubbers on your smokestacks. The difficulty here is that regulators need a ton of information. They need to know the specifics of each industry, the different technologies available, the costs of reducing pollution for different firms.
Which is hard for a central agency to know perfectly.
Very hard. It often leads to inefficiencies because the regulations might be too strict for some firms and too lenient for others, or they might mandate a technology that isn't the cheapest way to reduce pollution for a particular factory.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about the market-based policies? You said economists tend to like these better. Let's start with corrective taxes.
Right. Corrective taxes, sometimes called Pigovian taxes, after the economist Arthur Pigou, who first proposed them, are designed specifically to induce private decision makers to take account of the social costs that arise from a negative externality.
Like the pollution tax we discussed earlier.
Exactly. The idea is to set the tax equal to the external cost. An ideal corrective subsidy, similarly, would equal the external benefit of a positive externality.
And why do economists prefer these taxes over, say, just telling each factory, cut pollution by X amount?
Because taxes can achieve the same pollution reduction target at a lower overall cost to society. Let's go back to our two factories, the paper mill and the steel mill. Suppose each dumps 500 tons of glop into a river, and the EPA wants to reduce total pollution to 600 tons total, so a cut of 400 tons.
Okay.
A command and control approach might say each factory must cut emissions to 300 tons. Simple, right?
Seems fair on the surface.
Maybe. But what if it's really cheap for the paper mill to cut pollution, maybe only costs them $10 per ton, but it's incredibly expensive for the steel mill, say $100 per ton? Mandating equal cuts forces the steel mill to undertake very costly reductions.
I see. The total cost of reducing 400 tons could be high.
Exactly. Now consider a corrective tax instead.
Yeah.
Suppose the EPA levies a tax of, say, $50 per ton of glop emitted.
What happens then?
Well, the paper mill looks at the tax. It costs them only $10 to cut a ton of pollution, but it costs $50 in tax if they don't cut it. So they'll reduce their pollution significantly, right down to the point where the cost of cutting more would exceed the $50 tax.
Okay, they'll cut a lot because it's cheaper than paying the tax.
Right. Now, the steel mill, it costs them $100 to cut a ton. The tax is only $50. So they'll find it cheaper to just pay the tax rather than making those very expensive reductions. They'll pollute more, but pay for it.
So the paper mill does most of the cleanup.
In this example, yes. But the key is the total pollution reduction of 400 tons is achieved, but it's concentrated in the factory that can do it most cheaply. The tax automatically allocates the reduction effort efficiently, minimizing the total cost to society.
That's clever. The tax lets the firms decide based on their own costs.
Precisely. And there's another advantage. Taxes give firms a continuous incentive to develop cleaner technology. If the paper mill finds a way to reduce pollution for only $5 per ton, they'll do it to save even more on taxes. Under command and control, once they hit the 300-ton limit, they have no incentive to reduce further.
So taxes promote innovation too.
They do. And unlike most taxes, which distort incentives and create economic inefficiency, what economists call deadweight loss, corrective taxes actually enhance economic efficiency by correcting the market failure. They make the economy work better.
That's a really strong case. The chapter mentions the gasoline tax as a prime example, right?
Yes, it's a great real-world case study. Gasoline taxes in many countries can be seen as corrective taxes aimed at several negative externalities associated with driving.
Okay, what are they?
Well, first, congestion. More cars mean more traffic jams, lost time, frustration. A gas tax makes driving more expensive, and curbing alternatives like public transport, carpooling, or even living closer to work.
Makes sense.
Second, accidents. Driving creates risks for others. Larger vehicles, in particular, pose greater risks. The gas tax makes people pay indirectly for the accident risk they impose.
Okay.
And third, pollution. Cars produce smog, which harms health, and burning gasoline releases carbon dioxide, contributing to climate change. The tax reduces gasoline consumption, thus lowering these environmental impacts.
So the gas tax is doing triple duty, potentially.
Potentially, yes. And many economic studies suggest that the optimal corrective tax on gasoline reflecting these externalities might actually be significantly higher than what we currently see in, say, the United States.
Interesting. And the revenue could be used for other things?
Absolutely. It could be used to lower other taxes that do distort the economy, like income taxes, potentially leading to a net improvement in efficiency.
Okay, that covers corrective taxes. What about the other market-based policy? Tradable pollution permits, how do those work?
These are also really fascinating and have proven quite effective. Let's go back to our paper and steel mills again. Remember the command and control scenario where each was forced to cut pollution to 300 tons?
Yeah.
Now, suppose the EPA issues permits allowing a total of 600 tons of pollution, maybe giving 300 permits to each factory initially. Each permit allows the holder to emit 1 ton of glop.
Okay, so they have a right to pollute up to 300 tons.
Right. Now remember, it's cheap for the paper mill to reduce pollution, play 100 tons, and expensive for the steel mill, $100 ton. The steel mill might think, gee, I'd love to pollute more than 300 tons because reducing is so expensive. The paper mill thinks, I could easily pollute less than 300 tons.
But could they make a deal?
Exactly. The steel mill could go to the paper mill and say, hey, I'll pay you, say, $60 for each ton you reduce below 300 if you sell me your unused permits.
Would the paper mill agree?
Yes. It only costs them $10 to reduce a ton, but they get paid $60 for the permit. They make a profit of $50 per ton reduced. The steel mill is also happy because paying $60 for a permit is cheaper than spending $100 to reduce pollution themselves.
So they trade the permit.
They trade. The paper mill pollutes less, the steel mill pollutes more, but the total pollution remains capped at 600 tons, the total number of permits issued. And crucially, the pollution reduction is still being done by the firm that can do it most cheaply, the paper mill.
It creates a market for the right to pollute.
Precisely. A market for pollution permits emerges. The permits will naturally flow to the firms that value them the most, which means those firms facing the highest costs of reducing pollution. The initial allocation of permits, who gets them for free initially, doesn't actually affect the final efficient outcome in terms of who pollutes and how much reduction happens, although it does affect who ends up richer or poorer.
So how do these permits compare to the corrective tax? They sound like they achieve a similar result.
They are very similar, in effect. Both put a price on pollution, forcing firms to internalize the externality. The main difference lies in how that price is determined.
Okay.
With a corrective tax, the government sets the price of pollution, the tax rate. Firms then respond by choosing how much to pollute at that price. The supply of pollution rights is perfectly elastic at the tax rate.
Right. They can pollute as much as they want as long as they pay the tax.
Correct. With tradable permits, the government sets the quantity of pollution allowed, the total number of permits. The trading between firms then determines the market price of a permit. Here, the supply of pollution rights is perfectly inelastic, fixed by the government.
So tax sets the price, permits set the quantity.
Exactly. If the government knows exactly what the demand curve for pollution rights looks like, they can achieve the same outcome with either policy. If they're unsure about the demand curve, the choice matters more. If they want certainty about the amount of pollution, permits are better. If they want certainty about the price of polluting, a tax is better.
Has the permit system been used successfully?
Oh, yes. A standout example is the U.S. program for sulfur dioxide, SO2 emissions, primarily from power plants, which was implemented to combat acid rain. It used a cap-and-trade system, basically tradable permits, and was highly successful in reducing SO2 emissions significantly and cost-effectively.
Okay, that's compelling. But some people just object to the whole idea. They say you shouldn't be able to pay a pollute, that a clean environment is a right, not a commodity to be bought and sold. How do economists generally respond to that?
That's a common ethical objection, but economists tend to have, let's say, limited sympathy for it, primarily because it ignores fundamental economic principles.
Like what?
Like the first principle, people face trade-offs. Clean air and clean water are incredibly valuable goods, no question. But they have an opportunity cost. Achieving perfectly pristine air and water would require enormous sacrifices we'd have to give up many goods and services, technologies, and conveniences that contribute to our standard of living.
So zero pollution isn't really feasible or even desirable?
For most pollutants, no. We have to weigh the benefits of environmental protection against the costs. Eliminating all car travel or all electricity generation to stop pollution just isn't practical. Economics is about managing scarcity, including the scarcity of a clean environment. Economists argue that thinking of a clean environment as a good, like other goods, is helpful. Richer societies can afford and typically demand higher levels of environmental protection. And just like any good, the lower the cost of obtaining it, the more people will want.
And market-based solutions lower the cost.
Exactly. Corrective taxes and tradable permits reduce the cost of achieving any given level of environmental protection compared to command and control. By making environmental protection cheaper, they actually tend to increase the public's demand for it. So, far from being anti-environment, these policies can lead to better environmental outcomes more efficiently.
That's a really important counter-argument. Okay, we spent a lot of time on government solutions, but the chapter also talks about private solutions. Can people sometimes sort these externality problems out themselves?
Often, yes. Government intervention isn't always needed or even the best approach. There are several ways private actors can address externalities.
Such as?
Well, think about simple moral codes and social sanctions. Most of us don't litter, right? It's not just the fear of a fine, it's generally considered the wrong thing to do. Societal norms, like the golden rule, do unto others, encourage us to think about how our actions affect others, essentially, to internalize externalities without any laws.
Interesting. So social pressure works.
It can. Another way is through charities. Many environmental organizations, like the Sierra Club or the Nature Conservancy, are funded by private donations. They work to protect ecosystems, which provides a positive externality for everyone. Universities also receive huge donations, partly recognizing the positive externalities of education. Governments even encourage this by making charitable donations tax deductible.
Right. And what about businesses themselves?
Sometimes businesses can solve externalities through self-interest by integrating different activities or through contracts. Mankiw uses a great example, an apple orchard next to a beekeeper.
Ah, yes, the bees and the blossoms.
Exactly. The bees pollinate the apple trees. That's a positive externality for the orchard owner. The apple blossoms provide nectar for the bees to make honey. That's a positive externality for the beekeeper.
Mutual benefits.
Right. If they operate as separate businesses, each might underinvest. The orchardist might not plant enough trees. The beekeeper might not keep enough bees because they don't capture the benefit they're providing the other party.
So how do they solve it privately?
Well, one way is integration. The beekeeper could buy the apple orchard, or vice versa. Now, one owner controls both activities and has every incentive to figure out the optimal number of trees and bees to maximize the combined profit. They've internalized the externality by merging.
Or they could just sign a contract.
Yes, they could negotiate a contract specifying how many trees the orchardist will maintain, how many hives the beekeeper will provide, and maybe involve payments between them to account for the benefits conferred. This explains why some large companies are involved in multiple, seemingly different lines of business. Sometimes it's about internalizing externalities between those stages.
That integration idea is really powerful. And this leads us directly to the famous Coase theorem, doesn't it? What does that tell us?
It does. The Coase theorem, named after Nobel laureate Ronald Coase, is a really profound insight into private solutions. It states that under certain conditions, private parties can actually solve externality problems on their own and reach an efficient outcome, regardless of how property rights are initially assigned.
Okay, unpack that. What are the conditions?
The crucial condition is that the private parties must be able to bargain with each other at zero cost. No transaction costs.
No cost to negotiating and enforcing a deal.
Okay. If that condition holds, Coase argued, the private market will figure it out. Let's use Mankiw's example. Emily has a dog, Clifford, who barks. The barking annoys her neighbor, Horace.
A classic negative externality. Emily gets the benefit of the dog. Horace bears the cost of the noise.
Right. A social planner would look at how much Emily values the dog versus how much Horace dislikes the barking to decide if overall having the dog is efficient.
Make sense?
Coase says Emily and Horace can reach that same efficient outcome themselves through bargaining, if bargaining is free. Suppose Emily values having Clifford at $1,000, but the barking imposes an $800 cost, in terms of annoyance, lost sleep, on Horace.
Okay. Benefit is greater than the cost.
In this case, the efficient outcome is for Emily to keep the dog, and the Coase theorem predicts this will happen. Horace might offer Emily money to get rid of the dog, but he won't offer more than $800, his cost. Since Emily values the dog at $1,000, she won't accept less than $1,000. No deal is made. Emily keeps the dog, efficient.
Okay. What if the numbers are flipped?
Right. Suppose Emily values the dog at only $500, but Horace's cost from the barking is $800. Now, the efficient outcome is for the dog to go.
Can they bargain to that result?
Yes, according to Coase. Horace dislikes the barking, $800 cost, more than Emily likes the dog, $500 benefit. Horace could offer Emily, say, $600 to get rid of Clifford. Emily would accept because $600 is more than her $500 benefit. Horace is also better off. Paying $600 is less than suffering the $800 cost. The dog goes. Efficient again.
And Coase said it doesn't matter who had the initial right, like whether Emily had the right to a barking dog or Horace had the right to peace and quiet.
Exactly. That's a key part of the theorem. The initial allocation of property rights affects who pays whom the distribution of wealth, but it doesn't affect the ability to reach the efficient outcome through bargaining, assuming zero transaction costs. If Horace had the legal right to silence, Emily would have to pay him between $500 and $800 for permission to keep the dog in the second scenario, but the dog would still end up going because her benefit is less than his cost. The resource, the dog or the quiet, ends up where it's most valued.
That sounds almost magical. Like private bargaining can always fix things, but it feels too good to be true. Why don't we see private solutions working all the time?
You're right to be skeptical. The magic relies entirely on that crucial assumption: zero transaction costs. And in the real world, that assumption often fails spectacularly.
What are transaction costs?
So they're basically all the costs parties incur in the process of agreeing to and following through on a bargain. Things like the time and effort spent negotiating, hiring lawyers to draft contracts, costs of enforcing the agreement if someone reneges. Even communication barriers like needing translators if parties speak different languages.
Okay, so if these costs are too high.
If the transaction costs are higher than the potential gains from making the deal, then the bargain won't happen, even if it would be mutually beneficial otherwise. The externality problem persists because it's just too costly to negotiate a private solution.
Are there other reasons bargaining might fail?
Yes. Sometimes bargaining just breaks down. Parties might hold out, trying to get a better deal, and end up with no deal at all. Think of labor strikes or protracted legal battles where both sides lose out compared to a reasonable settlement. Stubbornness or strategic behavior can prevent efficient outcomes.
And what about when there are lots of people involved?
That's probably the biggest hurdle in many real-world externality cases. Think back to the factory polluting a lake that's used by hundreds, maybe thousands of fishermen.
Right.
How could you possibly coordinate all those fishermen to bargain effectively with the single factory? Just organizing them, agreeing on a negotiating stance, collecting contributions to potentially pay the factory, or deciding how to distribute payments from the factory. The transaction costs would be astronomical. It's practically impossible.
So the Coase theorem works best with small numbers of parties and low negotiation costs.
Exactly. When transaction costs are high, or the number of parties involved is large, private bargaining is likely to fail. And that's precisely when government intervention, whether through command and control or market-based policies, often becomes necessary as a way to achieve a more efficient outcome. Government acts as an institution for collective action that can overcome these bargaining problems.
So the chapter even has that fun, relatable example of reclining your seat on an airplane, right? Connecting it to Coase.
Yes, it's a great illustration. The argument, often made by writer Josh Barrow, is that the person in front essentially owns the property right to recline their seat into the space behind them.
Okay, even though it might crush my knees.
Right. The Coase theorem would suggest that if your knees are truly bothered, i.e. you suffer a cost, and that cost is greater than the benefit the person in front gets from reclining, you should be able to pay them to keep their seat upright.
Like offering them $5 not to recline.
Exactly. If transaction costs were zero, it's easy to talk, make the exchange. You'd expect these little bargains to happen all the time on flights if the valuations lined up correctly.
But they almost never do.
They almost never do. And why not? Likely because transaction costs aren't zero. It might feel awkward. Maybe you don't have cash. Maybe you can't easily communicate. Or perhaps the valuations just don't line up often enough. The recliner values reclining more than the person behind values the knee space. But the absence of these deals perfectly highlights how transaction costs or differing values prevent the purely private cohesion solution in that everyday situation. So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, the big takeaway is this. Adam Smith's invisible hand is powerful, incredibly powerful, but it's not omnipotent. It has limits.
And externalities show us those limits.
Precisely. These uncompensated impacts on third parties' externalities, they represent market failures. The market, on its own, doesn't arrive at the socially optimal outcome. Negative externalities, like pollution, lead to overproduction compared to the social ideal. Positive externalities, like research spillovers or vaccinations, lead to underproduction.
Oh, yeah.
And we've seen that governments have tools to address this. They can use command and control regulations, just setting rules. Or often more efficiently, they can use market-based policies, corrective taxes for negative externalities, subsidies for positive ones, or tradable permit systems to internalize these external effects to make decision makers face the true social costs and benefits.
But government isn't always the answer either.
Not always. Sometimes private solutions work. Moral codes, social sanctions, charities, or private bargaining, as the Coase theorem highlights, can resolve externality problems effectively if transaction costs are low and the number of parties is small. But those ifs are often big barriers in the real world.
So, for you listening, what's the bottom line? Understanding externalities really helps you see beyond just the sticker price of something. It gives you a lens to understand the full impact of economic activities. You now have a framework drawn from basic microeconomic principles to analyze why we have certain government policies, everything from gas taxes and pollution controls to patent laws and funding for public education. It's all about addressing these market failures.
Aligning incentives.
And it helps appreciate the really complex trade-offs society is constantly making between, producing goods and services and dealing with the side effects, both good and bad. It encourages you to think more critically about the full social costs and benefits involved in choices we make every day, individually and collectively.
It adds a whole dimension to economic thinking.
It really does. We hope this deep dive into Chapter 10 and the world of externalities has given you a clearer perspective and maybe sparked some new questions for you to explore. Thanks so much for joining us on the deep dive.